Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Tipper, Marble Hunting. I feel like at this point Tipper is the kind of artist whose reputation speaks for itself. Guy's been around since the late 90s and early 2000s and is considered a pioneer in the new school break scene, having regularly put out albums over the past 20 plus years that range anywhere from hard-hitting breakbeat, hip-hop, and dubstep material to high-detail ambient and downtempo. But as well respected as he always has been, it feels like he really blew up in the downtempo scene with the releases of his last three albums throughout the 2010s. Broken Soul Jamboree, Forward Escape, and Jettison Mind Hatch. The latter of which I reviewed and did the full and brief segment on. He's not exactly a household name, but his fan base is intense. I had seen so many comments from people before I made my first review of him, holding up an album like Jettison Mind Hatch as one of the best of the entire decade, or even one of the greatest downtempo albums of all time, shortly after its release. And I got a decent amount of backlash when I dared to say I merely thought that album was pretty good. Still stand by my feelings on that one, by the way. Still runs together for me and felt like a repeat of his Forward Escape album, even if I was really impressed by the production and attention to detail. With that said, even if I do personally have somewhat mixed thoughts on his catalog as a whole and don't think it's quite as consistently brilliant as it's so often made out to be, I obviously have a ton of respect for the guy and his very creative and unique style that he can call his own, as well as his versatility and consistent efforts to push his sound into new territory over the decades. And his best work really is just as fantastic as all the hype suggests it is. My two favorite albums of his being his debut from 2000, The Critical Path, and his above-mentioned 2010 album, Broken Soul Jamboree. Both of those albums are absolutely stellar and stand out on completely separate merits from each other. And that's obviously not to get into his half-improvised live sets, which I have not been able to see thanks to A, not happening close to where I live, B, being an exceedingly rare occurrence to begin with these days, and C, tickets being a bit out of my price range. But people have told me that's the way you're actually supposed to be experiencing his music. That's where he tests out most of his unreleased material before he eventually works it into his studio output, and as such, whenever a new Tipper album drops these days, the diehard fans will already be familiar with the vast majority of it. Anyway, I'm sure I've worried the usual fans a bit with my less than ravenous enthusiasm for Tipper's work in that prelude, but hopefully their fears can be somewhat quelled to know that I think this latest album he just dropped last week, Marble Hunting, is one of my favorite albums he's put out in years. It's not anything new for him or shows him moving in a bold new direction, but it does focus a lot more on the up-tempo side of his sound that he hasn't focused on in full album form since the 2000s. He normally saves his up-tempo material for his EPs, stuff like Bubble Control, Puzzle Dust, Shatterbox, Lattice, Flunked, It's Like. All those projects had much more of a faster-paced, experimental dubstep kind of feel compared to the more laid-back, IDM-ish approach of his albums. And Marble Hunting explores that sound over a 10-track release compared to the usual 4 or 5-track excursions he puts in that style. The album's still really short, only a half hour in total, but that length doesn't feel too scant for its own good. It feels like a complete album experience with a semi-coherent arc and pretty solid flow. And what really convinced me this album might finally just cross into great territory, whereas the last two didn't, is the fact that, as well-flowing as it is, this album does not run together. Even if all of these tracks fall under a similar style, I can tell all of them apart from each other and feel like they all have their own distinct identity. The album certainly starts strong with opener Guilty Feet, switching off between bright melodic chords and wobbling bass breakdowns, going over foot-tapping breakbeats. Definitely does a good job to grab your attention and set the tone for what you're getting into with the project as a whole. And those DJ scratches near the end are a nice touch. And that leads into following track Ground Score, which puts a similar blend of DJ scratching over some varied tapping bongo-like percussion and an almost trap beat that consistently builds up tension in a pretty epic way. It is a little basic compared to some other tracks here and was the pick I just happened to go with as my least favorite, but that's admittedly a bit of an arbitrary pick at that, and this track is pretty hype-inducing all the same. Low Battery Acid, true to its title, incorporates a lot of intense acid synth bass going over another shuffling glitch hop beat, and Trouble Pig sticks out to me more than any previous track thanks to the way he combines a similar mix of acid bass and glitch hop beats as the last cut, with all these punchy, chopped up funk samples. The way those slightly 60s, 70s-ish horn sections are just able to poke through the mix enough to give the whole thing that slight retro hip-hop flavor. Really cool stuff. Goner was a track I had mixed feelings on in its opening stretch. The somewhat stereotypical Middle Eastern-inspired lead melody running through the whole thing wasn't among the most pleasant of flavors, and the mix of bubbly leads and a stabby drop didn't stand out among the crowd at first. But then all these old-school break beats and flashier synth chords come in and end up more than salvaging the mix and still being a lot of fun. But I was even more pulled in by a track like Rancid Shuff, which almost starts like it could sound like a trance cut with its slow build-ups of fast-paced synth arpeggios, even though its bassy dubstep-ish drop makes the track live up more to its title. It's Rancid as in gritty and nasty and banging, obviously, not Rancid as in it sucks. This was another one of the easy highlights. And that leads into one of the bigger surprises here, Deal With It VIP. This is a new mix of a really old track of his that he already released on his Relish the Trough album way back in 2006. The original wouldn't have stuck out to me at all in that album's context. That was one of my least favorite of his albums for being pretty samey and presenting his new school break style in a comparatively really straightforward and basic way that he'd already proven himself to be able to do a lot better and more interestingly at that point. I'd honestly forgotten this track was a thing at all, but this VIP version is light years better than the original and brings it up to par with his modern standards of production and attention to detail, combining similar mixes of descending synths and banging old school break beats, but paying it off in drops of lots of different textures of dirty squelching bass going over other skittering beats, taking this track I originally found kinda lackluster and transforming it into one of the absolute biggest standouts on display. And you got Mason, which is cool, another kind of odd experimental dubstep cut with all these strange wobbling percussion noises that sound like he's warping the sound of tapping on glass jar lids or something like that, and then including all these various bubble popping sound effects. Interesting idea behind that one, even if it's not one of the biggest standouts here. At least not compared to a track like Knee Pads, which brings back the slight retro hip-hop vibes with all these warped horn blares, eventually shifting their shape into blasting distorted bass wobbles, and even including a few little high-pitched jazzy keyboard chords floating around in the background, also sidetracks into DJ scratching and a pretty damn kick-ass acoustic drum solo. And then finally we close with Pillow Roulette, which I guess somewhat feels like it mirrors the opener in all its mixes of brighter melodic textures bubbling and washing over each other. The drops on this one with the ascending synth riffs admittedly isn't among the most satisfying or hardest hitting of bass drops on the album. Aside from the beginning of the second one where he glitches the synths up a bit more, that's pretty kick-ass. But this track feels more than serviceable enough for a way for this album to go out. There we have it, 10 tracks and all of them are winners. There has been a part of me on some listens earlier on where I felt like maybe I wouldn't have minded an extra track or two added on for the album to feel more fleshed out from its mere half-hour running time. But at the same time, I don't think I actually want that. It feels sufficiently fleshed out in its current form. If I didn't see the length for myself and guessed based on how long it felt, I would have thought it was a more standard 40 minutes or something. And if you added in an extra track or two that didn't stick out to me as much, you lose the sense of tightness this album has, and possibly even land this project more in the frustratingly dragging territory that his last two albums had in for me. More would be nice, but it'd absolutely have to be of the same distinctive quality as the other tracks here and not overlap any ideas with the ones he'd already included. And I feel like that's not even fully necessary, since I'm more than happy to just keep this album in the exact form he's presented it in anyway. So yeah, there you have it. Marble hunting may not have left me feeling like I've lost my marbles, as it were, and it didn't reveal anything new to me about Tipper that I didn't already know. But I can still probably mark this as my favorite thing Tipper's put out since Broken Soul Jamboree. I'd definitely recommend giving it a shot if you've missed it. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.